2 gray U.S. Air Force C-17s drop out of the smog over Beijing and touch down at the Chinese capital's main airport. No flags, no red carpet, no motorcade yet, just heavy-lift cargo planes, the kind the U.S. only sends ahead of a president when it expects him to actually show up. In a month when Donald Trump is threatening new strikes on Iran and warning Tehran not to misbehave, those landings are the clearest concrete sign so far that despite the war, he still plans to walk into Beijing and sit across from Xi Jinping. The sightings didn't come from an official announcement. They came from Chinese plane spotters. Aviation photographers posted images on Chinese social media showing 2 US C-17 Globemaster III cargo aircraft with tail numbers 088204 and 055140 arriving at Beijing International Airport on Friday and Saturday. A British-based open-source tracking account, Armchair Admiral, picked up the same movements and noted that 2 more C-17s appeared to be en route to China at the time. For people who watch this stuff, the implication was obvious. Washington is prepositioning the presidential motorcade and support equipment. This is what happens before a U.S. president lands. C-17s are the workhorses of American presidential logistics. They're the high-wing four-engine heavy lifters that carry the beast, the armored presidential limousine, along with Secret Service SUVs, communications vans, and other, geared days before the president's own aircraft arrives. The same pattern has played out repeatedly under Trump's second term. At least 4 C-17s moved vehicles and equipment ahead of Vice President J.D. Vance's recent trip to Islamabad for Iran peace talks, and similar deployments were spotted before his visits to Hungary in April and to Armenia and Azerbaijan earlier in the year. Observers saw the same choreography before Trump's October visit to Qatar. That is why these flights into Beijing matter. They suggest logistics, not theory, and they arrive at a moment when the trip has looked anything but guaranteed. Trump had originally planned to visit Beijing in late March, but postponed to 14-15 May after launching the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran and blockading the Strait of Hormuz. As oil prices spiked and talks with Tehran stalled, analysts questioned whether he could afford to leave Washington. But on Friday, when asked directly if the China trip was still on, Trump said he was still planning to go and called it an amazing event in the making. The visit with China and Chairman Xi, that's going to be great, he added. Behind the scenes, the diplomatic machinery has been moving in parallel with the cargo planes. On Thursday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke by phone with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. According to Beijing's readout, Wang told Rubio that both sides should make good preparations for the important agenda for high-level interactions. The same day, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng, the country's top economic official and lead negotiator in trade talks, held a video call with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer. Afterwards, Bessent posted that he was looking forward to a productive summit between Trump and Xi in Beijing. This flurry of contacts fits a pattern. Before Trump and Xi met face-to-face in Busan, South Korea, last October, their teams laid similar groundwork with calls and side meetings. Before their phone call in September, the same. These are the protocol rituals of great power diplomacy. Foreign ministers, treasury officials, and trade negotiators clear the underbrush so that when the leaders meet, they can focus on the big questions without being tripped up by details. Those leadership optics matter because this will be the first visit by a U.S. president to China in nearly a decade. It also comes after years of tariffs, tech export controls, and recriminations that have pushed U.S.-China relations to their lowest point in a generation. A fragile tariff truce has paused some of the trade escalation, but disputes over semiconductors, data rules, and Taiwan remain. Chinese state media have already framed the upcoming summit as a test of whether the two countries can manage differences and prevent competition from sliding into outright confrontation. What makes the timing even more charged is that Trump is heading to Beijing while his war with Iran appears stuck in a dangerous stalemate. On social media this weekend, he said he would soon be reviewing the plan that Iran has just sent to us, but added that he can't imagine that it would be acceptable because, in his view, Tehran has not yet paid a big enough price for its actions over the past 47 years. Just hours earlier, he warned there was a possibility of fresh military attacks against Iran if they misbehave or do something bad. In other words, the same president now sending C-17s into Beijing is also threatening to widen a war that has already shut one of the world's most important energy choke points and rattled financial markets. For Beijing, that carries both risks and opportunities. China is Iran's biggest remaining oil customer and a key buyer of Gulf energy. It has watched the Hormuz crisis drive up its own import costs while also exposing U.S. vulnerabilities. At the same time, Beijing has been pushing for a de-dollarized global economy and for alternative trade routes that depend less on U.S.-secured sea lanes. Trump's trip, if it goes ahead as now signaled, will drop him into that mix. He will arrive in a country that is simultaneously simultaneously a strategic rival, a critical trading partner, and a potential mediator with Tehran. He will sit down with a leader who has watched him threaten allies in Europe, squeeze Iran, and talk about decoupling from China, and who has his own red lines on Taiwan, tech, exports, and maritime claims. The C-17s in Beijing tell us one thing clearly. Both sides are betting that, for at least 2 days in mid-May, it is worth trying to manage all of those contradictions face-to-face. The question is, what Trump wants from that room: leverage on Iran, relief on tariffs, guardrails on Taiwan, or just a photo of two presidents shaking hands, while American ships and Iranian boats shadow each other in the Gulf. In the next part, we'll dig into the mechanics behind this visit, how the presidential logistics machine works, what the presumptive talks between Wang Yi, Rubio, He Lifeng, and Bessent reveal about the agenda, and why Trump is gambling he can wage a war in the Middle East while cutting a deal in Beijing at the same time. When a U.S. president travels abroad, the first Americans to arrive are almost never diplomats. They're logistics teams and air crews. In Islamabad last month, Pakistani media and security sources described 3 large U.S. Air Force C-17s landing at Nur Khan Air Base across a single day, carrying security, equipment, and vehicles as Pakistan prepared for possible peace talks on Iran. Municipal authorities halted public transport and heavy goods traffic through Islamabad, rolled out barbed wire near the Serena Hotel, and ordered guests to leave as the U.S. advance team set up. At the time, Vice President J.D. Vance was still in Washington. His motorcade was seen at the White House, but the planes came anyway because the U.S. was preparing for the possibility that he and other senior officials might fly at short notice. The same pattern was visible before Trump's visit to Qatar last year, and Vance's trips to Hungary and the South Caucasus. C-17s first, motorcade hardware next, the principle last. So when Chinese and international spotters logged 2, and soon maybe 4, C-17s moving into Beijing Capital International Airport with specific tail numbers, they're not guessing blindly. They've seen this movie before, and they know how it usually ends, with a presidential aircraft on the tarmac a week or 2 later. Logistics, though, only tell you that a visit is likely. The calls between senior officials tell you why the visit matters. Over the past week, 2 sets of conversations have stood out. First, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke by phone with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. According to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Wang said both sides should thoroughly prepare for key high-level engagements and protect the hard-earned stability in bilateral ties. He also warned that Taiwan remains the greatest risk in U.S.-China relations. Almost simultaneously, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng held a video call with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. Chinese readouts say he raised serious concerns over recent U.S. economic and trade restrictions, while Bessent later wrote that he looked forward to a productive summit between Trump and Xi in Beijing. This pairing, diplomats on one line, economic chiefs on another, is a classic way to shape a leader-level agenda. Security and politics in one track, tariffs and technology in another, ready to be stitched together when Trump and Xi sit down. So, what's likely to be in that stitched-together file? Reporting from the BBC, the Korea Times, and other outlets points to a few central themes. First, Taiwan. Beijing has made no secret that it sees U.S. weapons sales and political support for Taipei as the biggest threat to stability. Chinese state media have framed the summit as a test of whether Washington will respect red lines on Taiwan in exchange for cooperation on other issues. A recent U.S. package, valued at more than $10 billion over several years, has infuriated Beijing, and officials there are likely to demand assurances that Trump will not cross into what they see as overt support for independence. Second, trade and technology. A fragile truce has paused some tariff hikes, but both sides are still locked in disputes over export controls on advanced chips, Chinese access to U.S. cloud services, and new U.S. rules on data security. Chinese readouts of recent calls emphasize serious concerns about U.S. economic measures, while U.S. officials talk about the need for level playing fields and protection of critical technologies. Given that American farmers and manufacturers have been hit by both tariffs and the Iran-driven oil price spike, Trump has an incentive to use the summit to secure at least symbolic wins, such as fresh promises of Chinese soybean purchases or progress toward easing some tariffs. Third, and looming over both of those, the war with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz crisis. China is both a major importer of Gulf oil and a political partner of Tehran. With Hormuz disrupted by fighting and U.S. naval seizures of Iranian cargo, Chinese refiners are paying more for crude, and Chinese investment projects tied to Iran's energy sector are at risk. For Washington, that creates leverage. Beijing wants stability and could in theory pressure Tehran, but it also creates vulnerability because China can cast the U.S. as the main driver of economic pain. Trump's recent messages underline how fluid the Iran situation is as he prepares for Beijing. In late April, he said publicly that the U.S. might exit the Iran war very soon, within weeks, if Tehran complied with certain demands. Then, over the weekend, he wrote that he had received a plan from Iran but can't imagine it would be acceptable because, in his view, Iran has not yet paid a big enough price for what they have done to humanity and the world over the last 47 years. He warned that if Iran misbehaves or does something bad, the US could launch fresh attacks. This is the strategic context in which Trump will walk into the Great Hall of the People. On one side of the table, a Chinese leadership that wants to prevent the Iran war from wrecking its economy and to stop Taiwan from sliding further into Washington's orbit. On the other, a US president who wants to keep maximum pressure on Tehran, reassure jittery markets at home, and show his base that he can be tough on China and still do deals. If that sounds like too many objectives for a single summit, it is. But that's exactly why both sides are spending so much time on the choreography. Chinese officials are signaling that they want to safeguard stability and avoid surprises. US officials are signaling that the visit is still on schedule despite the war, and that they see value in at least maintaining leader-to-leader communication. The C-17s in Beijing are part of that choreography. They tell the world and domestic audiences that the visit is real enough to warrant moving armored limousines, communication suites, and whole convoys of Secret Service vehicles halfway around the world. They also serve a quieter purpose. Once those assets are on the ground, canceling becomes more expensive, both politically and logistically. If Trump were to pull out now, it would be visible not just in press releases, but on the Beijing tarmac. At the same time, the summit's success is not guaranteed. Chinese readouts already carry warnings on Taiwan. US briefings already stress that Trump will not compromise on core interests or on punishing China for alleged support to Iran and Russia. Analysts quoted in regional media say the best-case outcome might be a joint statement promising to avoid military incidents, modest steps on trade, and a vague pledge to encourage de-escalation in the Gulf. The worst case would be a public clash that leaves relations even more brittle. For now, what we can say with confidence is this: the logistics are in motion, the phone lines are busy, and both Washington and Beijing are acting as if Donald Trump will be in China on 14-15 May. For Beijing, Washington, and Taipei, those C-17s on the runway are about more than a single visit. They're a sign that, war or no war, the two most powerful presidents on Earth still think they have to look each other in the eye. For Xi, analysts say the unfinished Iran conflict may actually strengthen his hand. The longer Trump is tied down in the Gulf and Hormuz, the more leverage Beijing has on issues like energy, sanctions, and global markets. For Trump, the summit is less about breakthroughs and more about proving he can keep talking to a rival while turning the screws on Iran and reassuring allies that the system isn't breaking. Taiwan's 23 million people will not be in the room, but Xi is expected to put their future at the top of the agenda, and every word Trump uses or avoids on that question will be parsed for clues. The best most experts expect is managed competition, no grand bargain, just guardrails that stop rivalry from sliding into a direct clash, while the Iran war and the Hormuz crisis keep reshaping the global map. If you want more investigations that follow the planes, the phone calls, and the fine print instead of the slogans, hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.